Well, good morning, everybody. I want to talk about a subject that I've had on my mind for several years, actually, and I've just kind of been figuring out where I wanted to go with it and where all we, what all we wanted to talk about. Because sometimes there are subjects that, if you allow them, they'll kind of span almost everything, and you can go down rabbit trails. And I don't want to follow those rabbit trails too much, but I think in this last week I've sort of brought together my thoughts on it. They've kind of coalesced into a lesson. So I want to talk about church buildings a little bit today. Church buildings, where they come from, what the Bible has to say about it, what church buildings are used for, and what they ought to be used for by what we see in the scriptures as well. What kind of authority that we have to not only have a building in the first place, but what are we supposed to do with it? And at the end, I'm going to bring in, hopefully, some really good practical application that not only we're just talking about the technical side of it, of where do they come from, why do we have them, what's the authority, but what's maybe the deeper lesson that we can take away from the existence and the use of a facility like the one that we have here at East Shelby. I want to start off talking a little bit about the broad spectrum, though, of church buildings and their uses. If you've ever noticed driving through town, you'll notice that a lot of denominations can kind of be, you can tell who's in that building based on the way the building looks. You know, whether it's very, very ornate or it's very plain, you can kind of guess like, okay, well, I don't even have to see the sign to know that that building belongs to this group of people. Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, don't have any windows in their buildings. Maybe you've never noticed that or you didn't know that, but that's one of those kind of quirks of the Jehovah's Witnesses is no windows in their buildings. Maybe you see a Greek Orthodox church, or at some point maybe you've gone on a tour of a Greek Orthodox church with their icons and everything like that. You might go through a Greek Orthodox church and you might see like, it's kind of an overstuffed place with lots of stuff hanging on the walls and like lots of tchotchkes, like you're at an overfilled antique store or something like that. Maybe you've toured a cathedral at some point. When Rebecca and I were in New York earlier this year, we went to St. Patrick's Cathedral, incidentally, on St. Patrick's Day. And they had the cathedral opened up for tours, and it's grand, it's huge, it's ornate. The architecture draws your eyes upward, and that, of course, is very intentional. The Mormons, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, all their buildings look the same because they've basically got a floor plan and an architecture plan that they just use kind of across the board. So if you ever see that LDS building in town, it basically looks just like the one in the next town over and the next town over and the next town over. And in Boise, Idaho and Salt Lake City, it's the same way, where it's just an LDS facility on every corner. There's a joke about Churches of Christ, though, that I don't know how true it is anymore, but probably there was a time when it was pretty true. Somebody once joked about, how do you find a Church of Christ when you're like from out of town? Like if you're going through a town and you want to, well, where does the Lord's church meet? Just cross the railroad tracks to the bad part of town and look for the ugliest cinder block building, and you've found yourself a Church of Christ. And again, I don't know how true that is anymore, but especially pre-war, pre-1945, that was almost always the case when it came to where the Lord's church was meeting on any given Sunday. You know, there seems to be two extremes when it comes to the problems related to church buildings. On one end, on this extreme way over here, you have some people who argue we shouldn't have them at all, right? They'll say, well, where's the authority for it in the first place? Because I read in the New Testament that Christians met in this place, that place, that place. There's not really any kind of pattern established. And maybe we shouldn't have church buildings at all because you look at the budget that's attached to it, the heating bills, the electric bills, the water bills, the repairs and the upkeep. You look at everything that's attached to a building, and when there are Christians starving to death in the world, what are we doing here with a building like this that costs this much money to maintain? And of course, on the other side of it, the other extreme is, I think we should have more. Like, why don't we build a fellowship hall and a gymnasium and a rock climbing wall while we're at it? And, we can have like a health and fitness spa attached to it and a coffee shop. You got to have a coffee shop, more than just Ryan's Keurig up in his office. We've got to have the East Shelby Church of Christ Cafe, and we'll call it something hip so the young people like it. We'll call it like the Edge Cafe or something like that, And it'll have a neon sign on the wall in the background. And so that extreme says, hey, if you're going to have a church building, go all in. Like, do everything. All the bells and whistles, white columns everywhere and stuff hanging from the ceiling. And I want all the bells and whistles to the point that it becomes just a cavernous cathedral, Notre Dame or something like that. And so you got these two extremes on an idea of what church buildings ought to be. And what I really want to get at is, where do we find the rationale in the Scripture for our own facility? Where is the scriptural authority for the way that we have put together a facility and how we use it, and what the purpose is behind that, and where maybe some lines ought to be drawn? Some of them are scriptural, some of them are just simply kind of reasonable. Like, maybe there's just an idea that when is too much too much? And we got to apply some of that logic to how we use a building and the way that we conduct ourselves in this. And I think this lesson is especially pertinent given two realities that I have observed in my time here at East Shelby. And that's, first of all, there's this constant need that we have to find like problems or solutions to our space. As churches change over time, sometimes churches grow, sometimes they contract for a little while. Sometimes you have lots of kids and you got to figure out where you put all of them, and sometimes you don't have as many kids. Sometimes you have a lot of adult classes and you've got to kind of rearrange rooms and manipulate the space in a way. And in just 4 years here at East Shelby, I've seen the way that different spaces in this building have had to be rearranged as our church shifts and changes. A lot of those changes have been really, really good, by the way, over the years. But a second thing that I see is, the age of the building and the upkeep on it. Because this is a very pretty building, and it's not like it's an old building, but if you know anything about houses and buildings, you kind of reach that 20-year mark, and what starts happening to a building? Everything starts falling apart. Like, air conditioners last about 20 years. A roof lasts about 20 years. Hot water heaters maybe don't even last 20 years. Carpet, how long does carpet last? Maybe 20 years. That springiness in the pews, the foam in the pews, 20 years. And it's so funny, like, you build a building and everything's brand new and fresh and it smells like new paint and new carpet. But then you get to be about 20 years later, it's like, oh, we didn't realize everything breaks all at the same time once a building is about 20 years old. And so there's a lot of consideration that you have to put into, the resources that go into maintaining a building like this. So let's go all the way back, like as far back as we can, because the scriptures themselves don't give a whole lot of description about like what buildings were like when Christians were meeting in them. Now we have examples of meeting in an upper room, meeting in a home, meeting in the school of Tyrannus. We have examples, but it's not like we're given like a description of, and this is what it looked like in this room, or this is what they used this space for, or they had a room for this thing over here. And so go all the way back. What is the first building that historians believe was what you might call a dedicated church building, at least that we know about? Well, there's an archaeological site called Dura Europos, and I'm trying to remember if it's between Syria and Turkey, kind of in that desert region between Syria and Turkey, and it was a residence. It's all part of an archaeological site at this point, and they dug up this, what looked to be a residence at one point, but was apparently converted for religious purposes, and this would have been, 223 to 256 AD, so middle of the 3rd century AD. And what they found in this archaeological site, in this reconstruction here on the screen, was a house that was converted to become a church facility. And historians and archaeologists believe that this is the first known, and they would have had things before this, but this is the first known dedicated church building, a building that was meant to be used as a church. And when it was converted for religious uses, it had several rooms. You see, number one there was an entry room, a courtyard, a place where people would enter into the building, and immediately to their left into room 2 would have been their assembly chamber. Sanctuary, whatever term you want to apply to it, but it would have been their kind of main assembly chamber. To the right from the courtyard, room number 1, you see number 3 up there is a baptistry, a small room that had an alcove into it and a baptistry built into the floor. And there are pictures you can see now of what that baptistry looks like. And in front of room number 1, it's not designated with a number there, but that checkered floor room, they believe, would have been used maybe as a learning space, what we might call a classroom. And so that's it. I mean, that's what they had. That's the site at Dura Europos. It's a very basic, very plain facility. You have a place to meet for assembly and worship. You have a place to come together to study. You have a place where you can baptize someone. And you have a place where the congregation can simply mill about and be together and interact with each other. And that's what you got there at Dura Europos. Now, over the centuries, the idea of a church building expanded and expanded and expanded. And, whether it's tradition or architecture or whatever it happens to be, you had these basilicas built and then grand cathedrals, and they just got larger and larger and larger and more elaborate. But I do think that's a really interesting archaeological site. Take it for what it's worth. It's not scripture, but it is interesting to see the simplicity and the plainness of a meeting place like that. So let's talk a little bit about the authority that we have. Local churches in the New Testament are commanded to do some things. We meet regularly for various activities such as worship and partaking of the communion. And you have examples of Christians meeting together on the first day of the week. You have direct commands about things that we ought to do together on the first day of the week. Assembling together is mentioned in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25. And, without taking that out of its context or saying that that's just a verse about attendance, which sometimes happens, unfortunately, we take Hebrews 10:25 and we say, that's a verse on attendance. Well, not really. It's a verse about coming together as Christians and challenging each other and building each other up and drawing forth from one another our spiritual strengths and not forsaking that. Not because we have to check a box off on our attendance and you're required to do it. You have to be there. Hebrews 10:25 says you have to be there. Well, you're not supposed to forsake it, because if you forsake that kind of challenging, spirit-enriching activity, then you're going the wrong direction spiritually. It's an indication of a loss of something valuable. But the point being that if a church is commanded to come together, if that's part of what Christians do, is to assemble together, to worship together, to commune together, to build each other up together, to teach each other, if that's part of the command of Scripture, then inherent in that is the authority to have somewhere to meet. If you're commanded to meet, you got to have somewhere to meet. And I think that there also has to be some consistency there. There has to be an understanding of we're going to meet in a place regularly so that people know where we are, so that people know where to find us, so that when we do come together, we all come together at the same place, right? If there's Christians in Collierville or Christians in Olive Branch or Christians in Memphis, and we're to come together in an assembly to challenge each other and build each other up and to worship together and commune together, that doesn't work if it's all like we wake up on Sunday morning and we just kind of go, well, I'm just going to walk out my front door and hope I bump into some Christians at some point today. No, there's some intentionality that has to be there. That I am not going to forsake the assembly because I know that there is an assembly here that happens at this place, that happens at this time with these people. And if I don't know that, I don't know where and when and with whom, how can I forsake something that I don't even know is happening or where it's happening or when it's happening? I do like James chapter 2. It's an interesting passage here that gets to the heart of welcoming people into our assemblies. Are we showing favoritism to people? Now, that's the point of James 2. So I don't want to take anything whatsoever away from the point of James 2, which is about favoritism and how we love each other and how we welcome people into our assemblies. But it is interesting when you read in James chapter 2, in this context on favoritism, he says in verse 2 of James 2, "For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to the one who's wearing the fine clothes, and you say, 'You sit here in a good place,' but you say to the poor man, 'You stand over there and sit down by my footstool,' have you not made a distinction among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? Listen, my beloved brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to you, to those who love him? But you've dishonored the poor man. Is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into the court?" That's a very challenging passage, isn't it? And I love the main point of that passage, which is when you come together in an assembly, are the doors flung wide open for all people who come to feel welcome, to hear the gospel, to worship God, and to be exposed to the Christian life in what it is meant to be? Is that what your assemblies are about? Except, of course, for the idea of God being at the center of it and worshiping him, because that's the main point of our assemblies. But are the doors flung wide open for all people? And when people come into our assemblies, do we treat some people a certain way and other people a different way? You got that nice looking family and they've got cute kids and the dad's wearing a tie and they seem safe and approachable? Do they have a crowd gathered around them because, well, those are our kind of people? And then someone else comes in and maybe they don't fit what our preconceptions are about, like a good quality church member. And they just kind of sit in a seat in the back and get ignored and neglected. And we hand them a visitor's card and be like, well, just fill that out and give it to someone. Just give that to someone. Well, that's the point of James 2. So I don't want to take away from that point at all. I don't want to distract from that point, but it is interesting. If you can extract a little bit from James 2, what do you learn about churches? Well, first of all, you learn they do assemble, right? There is an assembly. There's a gathering and a coming together of Christians. What else do you learn about that assembly? Well, it's public. People know where it is. People know when it is, because he's talking about visitors coming to your assembly. The rich man, the poor man, whoever it happens to be. How do they know where to go? How do they know when to be there if it is not public information that Christians in this community meet here at this time? If Christians just sort of meet wherever and it's just kind of we make it up as we go and we wake up on Sunday morning and we go, well, if some of us just want to get together at so-and-so's house at are you free at 2:30? You want to meet at 2:30 or something like that at so-and-so's house? If worship and assembly is just meant to be kind of like, let's kind of make it up as we go and we'll just meet wherever and it's just sort of nebulous, how does the rich man and the poor man know where to go and when to be there? And so Christians in the first century, and again, I'm extracting some from James 2 here, but Christians in the first century met regularly, consistently, in a defined place at a defined time. And their assemblies were open and public for visitors to come in. And so if you went to Ephesus and you went to Philippi and you went to Colossae and you said, hey, are there Christians here in Colossae? And where and when can I find those Christians? You would be able to find those Christians because their assembly was in a place at a time. And I think, again, that's not the main point of James 2, but I do think you can draw that conclusion. And are we using our assemblies in the same way? That yes, we're worshiping God first and foremost, but also by assembling together, aren't we promoting something? Aren't we showing something? Aren't we displaying and demonstrating something? We're demonstrating openness and willingness. We're demonstrating hospitality. We're demonstrating a teaching of the lost. If even just by opening up our doors and having windows to the outside world at least on some subtle level, aren't we, in some subtle, small way, living out the Great Commission by meeting in this way? Of course, the next question would be, all right, we talk about patterns a lot, right? Patterns in the New Testament. Can you establish a pattern? Well, if Christians are assembling and it's in a place and it's at a specified time in a regular way, like, is there a pattern in the New Testament for where we're supposed to be meeting? What kind of building we're supposed to have? Well, let me show you a few things here. First of all, you find Christians that met in the temple complex in Jerusalem. This was the place initially where Christians were meeting when you read in Acts chapter 2 and onward. The temple complex, by the way, encompassed approximately 20 acres. So it was a big area. There was a lot of space for people. And there were different parts of the temple complex that could be used for different purposes. When it was either necessary or convenient, they also conducted teaching in their homes. Acts chapter 5 and verse 42 notes that. This was a huge church. I mean, it numbered in the thousands. And I think a point that I want to bring out is that growth was not seen as like a negative thing, the way that some people kind of view it today. Like, sometimes people have this attitude when churches grow to be pretty big, they go, I don't know, you kind of lose that personal touch when it comes to, you had a church to be 300 members, 500 members, 1,000 members, and you just sort of lose that personal touch when a church grows. Like, you notice in Jerusalem, when they're baptizing 3,000 people, and the church kind of swells to thousands and thousands, nobody's ever going like, I don't know about this. I sort of miss the good old days when it was just like 100 of us meeting in a house. I miss the good old days when our church, we just knew everybody's name. Now, is there something to knowing everybody's name? Sure. But church growth is not seen as a bad thing or a negative thing with churches in the first century. They probably had to get a little bit more creative about how they came together and where they came together. They probably had to get more creative about how do we kind of subdivide the group so that we have people who are being nourished and people who are being taught. And I think today we have to do the same thing about being a little bit more creative in how we come together as a church grows. Are there other facilities that we see in the New Testament that Christians use? Well, yeah, they frequently met in homes, and there's several scriptures up on the screen that illustrate this, that Christians met in their homes together. There would be churches that would gather together in members' houses. For small groups, often persecuted by their own communities, this was probably the most expedient way to go about worshiping and teaching together. Christians sometimes met in synagogues, at least initially, when disciples would first be drawn from the synagogues. Acts chapter 19, in Ephesus, this was said. When it was necessary, disciples might have rented or borrowed some kind of public facility, such as a schoolhouse. Acts chapter 19 notes that the Christians in Ephesus met in what's called the School of Tyrannus. Now, we don't know a lot about the School of Tyrannus, so I'm not gonna try to fill in the blanks and build some kind of case on the School of Tyrannus, but it was probably a facility there in Ephesus that was available for rent. It's possible that a member of the church was on the faculty of the School of Tyrannus. But whatever was behind it, it was a facility, it was available, and the church took advantage of it. And I think one thing I would note here about this is there really isn't much of a pattern, huh? For as much as we like to talk about patterns in Scripture, patterns, and you got to establish authority in patterns. Well, you got the temple complex, you got meeting in people's houses, you got a hypothetically rented facility in the School of Tyrannus. You have Christians that meet under trees and next to rivers and in their homes and in synagogues. Like, that really isn't a pattern, is it? And I think a good lesson when it comes to Bible authority is, and I hate to be trite about this because, throw a rhyme in there when you can. If there's no pattern to be found, there's no pattern to be bound. So the point I come across with that is, in the book of Acts and in other scriptures in the New Testament, can you establish this is what a church building, you have to meet in the temple complex, or you have to meet in your homes, or you have to meet in a schoolhouse? Well, no. The fact that they met here and they met there and they met here and they met there, it just leaves it open. Because where you meet is an expedient. The word expedient simply means a tool that helps you to accomplish something. If you have a nail that needs to go into a piece of wood, the most expedient way to do that is to get a hammer. Now, it doesn't mean that the hammer is the job or that the hammer is the product, but the hammer is the expedient, it's the tool that you use to drive the nail into the wood. And so where Christians meet, the temple complex, houses, upper rooms, under a tree next to a river, school of Tyrannus, in a synagogue, whatever it is, where Christians meet is simply the expedient that is used to accomplish the worshiping and the assembling and the teaching that is supposed to be done among Christians. Now, without a pattern, some might say, well, so that means there's no restrictions then, right? If there's no pattern, we can just do whatever we want. If we want, we can have a church hot tub. I mean, not that I don't use the baptistry for that 2 or 3 times a week anyway. You can really see the sin film over the top of the water when the light hits it just right. So does that mean that you can just build whatever you want? Because again, in the introduction, I talked about excess, right? So let's build it bigger, let's build it taller, let's fill it with more stuff. Let's have spires up on top and reach to the heavens and stained glass windows, and let's make it as elaborate as possible. There was a church that I knew about in Little Rock, actually, when I lived there, and it was called the Rock Church. And would you believe it? It was a rock climbing church. That was their shtick was, you can go to other churches and you can worship God sitting in an uncomfortable pew, but at the Rock Church, you can worship God on a rock climbing wall. Because pews are so uncomfortable, I'd rather be on a rock climbing wall, right? With a harness strapped around me, that's so much more comfortable, worshiping God. And so, are there some kinds of restrictions, right? Even though there's no pattern that says a church building has to look like this, we still can see in the Scriptures what the church does in the Scriptures. And the scriptural work of the church is to practice benevolence for other Christians, to take care of other Christians, to show love to other Christians in charity when that is needed, to practice edification and admonishment, and to encourage each other, to promote biblical education, so that we can teach our young people, so that we can teach each other, so that women can teach other women, men can teach other men, so that the young can teach the old, and so that the old can teach the young, right? Biblical education, fellowship and worship, so that as we share our worshiping together, we're also sharing a fellowship in that worship. The spreading of the gospel and the support of missionaries and preachers around the world. These are, on a fundamental level, these are the works of the church that you see in the New Testament. It's mission. And so even though the scriptures don't say your building has to have this thing and this thing, it has to look like this, and your building has to be this tall or this short, or it has this many rooms, we still know what the work of the church is. And if the building is an expedient, if it's a tool, if it's a hammer to drive the nail home, then it also has to be an expedient that works to accomplish scriptural goals. If you're trying to drive a nail into a piece of wood, you want your hammer to actually function in such a way that it gets the job done. And it doesn't need extra things and bells and whistles. It doesn't need to have other functions. It needs to be a hammer that drives a nail into the wood. Now, the mission is not the hammer. The mission is to drive the nail into the wood. But the hammer is the tool that's used. And so is our facility a reflection of scriptural principles about what it means to be the church and to work as the church? Does our facility meet those ends? Which leads to this last question. What about excess? Well, what do we do about that? Because I was talking to someone who's a member here. This was a few years ago, but I think her observation is still very much true. The very first time that she visited here before she placed membership, she had come from a place where, again, churches of Christ were cross the railroad tracks and look for the ugliest cinder block building in town, and you're going to find a Church of Christ meeting in that building. And she walked into here, and it was just like, the ceilings are really tall, and you got all the scroll work and everything, and the white caps on the pews, and it's like, She looked at her husband and said, "I think we're at the wrong church, honey." If you were raised in a very plain church building, this is a really elaborate building. It's got an elevator. That probably makes us a liberal church, doesn't it? It's got an elevator. But what about excess? You look at a building like this and you go, yeah, it's a lot of square footage, it's a lot of maintenance, it's a lot of money that goes into it. Not everything seems to be that necessary. Like this little round thing right here, I don't know why we need this little round thing. I don't know. Seems a little excessive to me, right? But what about excess? Well, I think here's where a little bit of the logic has to come in, and to be reasonable about it, to understand that over the centuries, church facilities, they have changed over time, like what our expectations are, what we view as reasonable. From generation to generation, what is considered reasonable has changed. What is considered necessary has changed. I mean, the fact that indoor plumbing and air conditioning and electrical systems and all that sort of thing, those things didn't exist even a few hundred years ago, and yet they're common items that we see. I think here's the lesson that I take away from it is stuff like this, the little ornamentation and the little accoutrements and everything, can we, in all honesty, compared to the scriptures, right? Looking at the scriptures, can we, in all honesty, take a look at a facility and say, all right, maybe this building doesn't look exactly the way a church building would have 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 1,500 years ago. But is it still fundamentally being used for things that are found in the scriptures? If we're assembling together, what's part of assembling? Well, if you're going to have 300 people assembling together, you probably have to have a place for them to relieve themselves. That's a physical necessity. It is what it is. You got to have bathrooms. You have 300 people gathered together. There's probably a need that those 300 people aren't, sweating themselves to death in the middle of Memphis summer. And if we're used to, in our homes and our cars and our business places, having air conditioning, I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to say that it is expedient to have air conditioning in a building. It's expedient. It serves the purpose as a tool for us to be together in an assembly worshiping. And so I just try to look at it as, let's be reasonable about this, and I try not to be too judgmental of, from one generation to another, from one century to another, maybe the way it looks now is not exactly how it looked 100 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 1,500 years ago, but can we apply some reasonableness to that perception? Let me offer some final observations. Observation number one is, the church is not the building. I feel like we shouldn't have to say that anymore, right? But we still have to say it. And I feel like we have to remind ourselves of that over and over and over again. East Shelby is not this building. East Shelby is us. It's the people. The church is not the building. Let's stop calling the church the building or the building the church. Let's stop getting those two things mixed up. Place does hold special value. God understands the emotional connections that we make and the sentimentality that we attach to certain places. When you read through the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament, I think you see that this is proven over and over and over again, that in the Old Testament in particular, look at the way that God and God's people attach very special emotional connections and significance to places, to mountains, to cities like Jerusalem, to rivers like the Jordan, to valleys, and even to the promised land in general, the promised land of Israel. You take a look at Psalm 84 sometime, and in Psalm 84, how lovely it is to dwell in your house. The writer of Psalm 84 is envious of the birds because the birds built nests up in the eaves of the sanctuary. And he's envious of the birds because the birds get to be in God's house all the time. And if only he could be in God's house all the time. And so I think God understands that places are special and that buildings can sometimes be more than just buildings. The place where you got baptized, the place where you got married, the place where where you share fellowship with other Christians, the place where we cry together and we laugh together. And so I do think it's okay for buildings to be special, just as long as they're kept in their proper context. Buildings can be a reflection of a community's values, a community like a faith community, a family, a church family. And not always, to be sure, but architecture does matter more than we might admit sometimes. For as much as I think we probably would poke holes in the grand cathedrals from the past, let's remember the motive behind why people built cathedrals in the first place. Because they wanted to point to God. Because they wanted the place where they worship God to be the tallest thing in town, where every component of the architecture draws your eyes upward symbolically to God in heaven. That in towns, medieval towns, there were laws in place where no other building could be taller than the tallest spire of the cathedral at the center of the town. And unlike grid systems in modern cities, in medieval cities, every road went to the cathedral, like spokes on a wheel. And again, for as much as we might poke holes in the excess that's involved in medieval cathedrals, I'm not advocating that we build a cathedral. I do think, let's not forget the motive that was behind that kind of architecture that said, God is at the heart of our town. God is at the heart of our community. Every road leads to a place where we worship God. And everything about that place where we worship God points our eyes upward to Him and recalls and reminds us of His glory. And in the book of Haggai, the Old Testament prophet, architecture mattered there as well, because God chides the people of that time period who had left the partially reconstructed temple to be just a boondoggle project in Jerusalem. And He says, while you live in your paneled houses and you're living luxuriously and taking care of your own affairs and your own business, what have you done to my house? You've neglected it. You've neglected it. And so our goal, similarly, is to do something huge and grand for God, not in the building that we make, not in the cathedral that's a testament to architecture or the labor that it took to build it. No, our goal is to build something huge and grand for God that is not made of bricks and stones. We're building up the church. And several passages up on the screen, 1 Corinthians 3 and in Ephesians 2 and verses 19 through 20, show what that mission is. To build up brick by brick, soul by soul, sermon by sermon, class by class, baptism by baptism, hug by hug, tier by tier. We are building up the church of Christ. Let's go ahead and end with a word of prayer right now, and we'll be dismissed to our classes. Our holy God in heaven, we thank you so much for this beautiful sunny day. We thank you so much for the glorious weather that we get to enjoy this time of year, the cool breezes in the morning, and the warm sunny days that are ahead of us almost every afternoon. It is a reminder of your glory. It is a reminder of the beauty of this world. Please help us to take time from this day, out of our own affairs, out of our own lives, to concentrate upon you, to love each other the way that we ought to give ourselves fully to worship and to study, to make this the Lord's Day, truly. Please help us as we go to our Bible classes here in just a few minutes. Be with all of our teachers, all of our kids, every one of our members, and any one of our visitors who's participating in our classes. Help us to be edified. And as we come together for the communion later on, we do pray that it will be a glory to you and a reminder to us of the incredible sacrifice of your Son. We do pray all this in His name. Amen.